Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the Architectural League's Program Director. Welcome to the first day of lectures by winners of the 2024 Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. Winners are selected each year through a juried portfolio competition organized around an annual theme. Entrants must be 10 years or less out of an undergraduate or master's program, so young in this case references career years rather than age. On behalf of the League, I'd like to thank the League Prize Committee, Sarah Assis, Rodrigo Escandón Cesarman, and Maggie Sang, all recent League Prize winners, for conceiving and explicating this year's competition theme, Dirty, and for their selection of additional jury members, Julie Bargman, Ursula Crippa, Anne Louis, and Ben Nicholson, who along with the committee devoted considerable time to individually evaluating the entries and then collectively participating in a thoughtful jury session to select 6 winners. Today brings the first pair of lectures by 2 of the 6 2024 League Prize winners. We hope that you can join us again next week, June 20th, and again on June 27th to hear presentations by other winners, with all sessions introduced and moderated by members of this year's League Prize Committee. We also hope that you'll visit each of the winners' online installations, which launched this week on the League's website, part of what will be an extensive collection of content available on archleague.org, including firm profiles as well as interviews and lecture videos. You can click on the link in the chat to view all of this content. Also watch for upcoming League Instagram takeovers by the winners, so please follow the League if you're not already. And all of the online material was created with the valuable support of League staff members Zoe Fruchter, Ann Carlisle, and Sasha Portas. Britt Cobb and Michael Beirut of Pentagram once again designed this program's memorable competition graphics, including the just released and downloadable exhibition poster, which has an embedded QR code that brings viewers directly to the installation on the League's website. We ask that you please, all of you, print out and post a copy or two to help get the word out. The entire program, from the competition to the installation, lectures, and related material, is made possible through the enthusiastic corporate sponsorship provided by Judlow, Tischler & Son, and Delta Millworks. League programs are also made possible in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Support is also provided by the Next Generation Fund, an alumni fund of the Architectural League's Emerging Voices in Architectural League Prize Program, and by the J. Clausen Mills Fund of the Architectural League, and through the support of the League's members and friends. Please visit the League's website, and where you can, in addition to learning more about this program, sign up for our weekly newsletter to learn more about upcoming events and lectures, and importantly, the extensive collection of online resources available, such as videos and essays documenting past programs and special projects. League Prize Committee member Rodrigo Escandón Cesarman will introduce today's speakers. A founding member of APRDELESP, a Mexico City-based studio, which focuses on practices research and on space and its appropriation. His firm's work has been published widely, including in the Harvard Design magazine, Log, Arquine, and Platt, and featured in numerous exhibitions, most recently in numerous Mexico City-based galleries and internationally at the Mexican Pavilion of the Venice Biennale and Art Center College of Design. Rodrigo holds a B.Arch from the Universidad Iberoamerica and an M.A. in Economics from Centro, both in Mexico City, and an M.S. in Architecture Studies and Design from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. After the winners' presentations, Rodrigo will join them in conversation and forward questions from the audience, so you can please post your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to the first day of presentations by the winners of Dirty, the 2024 Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. Today, we will be hearing from Lola Ben-Alon and Strat Coffman. My name is Rodrigo Escandón Cesarman, and I had the privilege of serving as part of the committee, which consisted of prior League Prize winners Sarah Assis and Maggie Sang. This year, the additional jury members were Julie Bargman, Ursula Crippa, Anne Louis, and Ben Nicholson. As members of the committee, Maggie, Sarah, and I were tasked with defining a theme for this year's competition. After many discussions, we finally settled on Dirty, in part because of its polysemic openness. We thought it would allow participants to frame their practices by celebrating all the meanings of dirty. Dirty as messiness and chaos in design processes, dirty as vulgar, illicit, unpleasant, improper, as well as erotic and even raunchy. And of course, dirty as in literally made of dirt or soil or clay. Perhaps more importantly, we asked participants to use the theme dirty to look beyond their own presentations of professionalism, respectability, and expertise, to expose the, well, often dirty forces that shape design practice, projects, modes of representation, and communication. Today, we will first hear from Lola Ben-Alon. The Natural Materials Lab, located at Columbia University GSAPP and founded and directed by Lola Ben-Alon, investigates raw, earth, and fiber-based building materials across scales, from fabrication research and design-build projects to policy investigations and installations. Lola Ben-Alon holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Civil Engineering from Technion Israel Institute of Technology, as well as a PhD in Architecture, Engineering, Construction Management from Carnegie Mellon University. She is an assistant professor at Columbia University GSAPP and teaches within Columbia University's Climate School. It was a coincidence, but I couldn't help but notice that we are starting the event series with a practice that is very much about literal dirt, soil, clay, mud, etc. The work at the Natural Materials Lab, however, is not merely about documenting existing fabrication processes or speculating upon them, but about directly testing and experimenting with the physical properties of dirt and clay. During our meetings, the jury highlighted how their projects bring forth the scale of the body with the tactile and sensorial qualities of these materials. And we also noted how Lola's work confronts dichotomies of quote-unquote natural or earthen materials versus, again, quote-unquote, artificial or industrial materials. We also talked about the messiness of the imperfect, sloppy prototypes of their baskets and structures, which pushes back against the trend of perfectly controlled 3D prints of mud and clay. Finally, we were excited to see weaving and fiber reinforcement strategies in 3D printing with clay, a technique that usually focuses exclusively on the resistance to compression of these materials. Trained as an architect, Strat Coffman's work explores the concept of the embodied subject as an agitator of design, in their own words. Currently located in both Ann Arbor and Los Angeles, Coffman's practice incorporates installation, set pieces, guerrilla practice, and wearable garments. Strat Coffman holds a Bachelor of Arts from Wesleyan University and an MArch from MIT. They are a 2022 to 2024 Architecture Fellow at Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Strat's portfolio was unique in the sense that it was perhaps the only one which took on the theme of dirty from the angle of the erotic and the sensorial. Strat's strategies of engagement undermine standard forms and formats of architecture, opening spaces for spontaneity and improvisation through estrangement. Members of the jury highlighted the ways in which, despite focusing on installation and wearable garments, Strat's work has a very direct and clear engagement with architecture. Finally, we were happy to see architectural things being used in ways that they're not supposed to be used. Strat has the unique talent of showing us how raunchy a detail of a railing can be. With all that being said, I welcome Lola Ben-Alon and Strat Coffman. First, we will hear from Lola, and then we will hear from Strat. And after that, we will have time for a discussion and questions from the audience. So please enter your questions in the Q&A section of this Zoom presentation.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Can you all see my screen okay? Can you all see my screen okay? Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to present my work today related to the theme of dirty or dirtiness and how I hope to generate projects that look at materials and bodies. And with me, there is a body of a small baby. So I hope for your patience if there is some background noise. So thank you first for the Architecture League for this amazing opportunity and the wonderful prize and this chance to show the work. The work at the Natural Materials Lab at Columbia GSAPP is a framework for me, essentially, to look at techniques and tectonics for digital fabrication of earth, but also for mechanical pressure and other modes of making, like manual craft of clay soils, plant fibers, and natural additives. And what I'm trying to do there is to combine fields related to geotechnical science, geology, geography, but also material design and experimental craft. So I'm going to jump right to it because creating the mixed design is the essence of the work and where the work starts. It's where the magic happens at the lab. From ancient figurine and brick making work in pre-pottery Neolithic period, it was all about the earth magic. It was all about the brick of life and brick as birth. Bricks of earth were pressed in the past, were sculpted in almost every region of the world, and artifacts made with earth were inscribed with text and placed into walls and buried underneath buildings for blessing, but also for protection. So through the hands-on and the field methods and sensorial experiences, this magic still exists today. We're looking here at ASTM standards for earth construction, and on the right on a shake test procedure to understand the clay content within soil. You'll learn to assess materials and to develop mixtures based on the local availability of these substances on and around the construction sites. So much of the lab's work is about creating the mixed design informed by practices of kitchen, practices of material recipes, very similar to cooking, where each ingredient in the mixed design has its role in the chemical process and the chemical reaction. For instance, flour may be the aggregate, egg might be the binder, etc. And you want to make a high-performance cookie, just like chef. So does the work with earth and fiber-based materials is much about the optimal mix design and articulating that. So when we think about material kitchens, we're asking to rethink what a laboratory is and to suggest multiple types of kitchens: a food kitchen, a lab, a manufacturing facility, an art studio, but sometimes also a field station. In this example, we asked how to obtain different fiber content mixtures to create lightweight gradients for thermal heat capacity versus insulation for one of the most localized heating environments, a chase, a chair. We called this very first prototype jandag, or body in Aramaic, because it uses a body made from a bamboo skeleton, light straw clay tissue, a clay skin, and above that, a flaxseed oil as a protective sealant. It's very similar to how our natural skin oil behaves. And inside, we passed radiant heat veins to pump heat and energy into the chase, as you can see here in this thermal imaging with the model, who were sitting on it and mentioned it was kind of like sitting on a piece of land warmed by the sun. So this is the sensation that might be achieved by a thermal mass. Going back to the mixed design, right? This is where we are. This is our starting point. We wanted to study here construction excavation waste from soils to stones in this project by the Natural Materials Lab in collaboration with Tommy Shaper-Cotter. So we went out to a quarry about an hour and a half from the city. It's an area where you can find a nice, rich brown clay loam, which is usually excavated during the foundation level of nearby projects and then dumped in this recycling facility. This project was commissioned by Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. It's located in Palisades in upstate New York, and we were invited to produce an installation that welcome people at the entrance to the geoscience building. What could be more important, this location, which is a home to the deep sea core collection, where they collect sedimentary layers from deep sea core layers of the earth to use it as time denomination and to understand histories of climate and environmental shifts. So rammed earth was this perfect representation of the lifts and shifts and pressure required for sedimentary rock creation. How can we use rammed earth in a raw state without stabilizers? Because when you see rammed earth out there, it's mostly stabilized with between 2 to 10% cement. And with this thick rammed earth wall, that concludes in almost the same absolute cement content as in a thin concrete wall. But what you can see in ancient rammed earth walls that still exist today is that there is certain erosion protocol that slows down erosion. And in here, we use the layer of lime every 4 to 5 lifts of soil. And what that does, it allows a surface texture that slows down water movement. And when the water is hitting the wall, it slows down. The outer layer of clay dissolves. That creates further textures, and then it reduces erosion even exponentially. The result was this rammed earth pavilion with 0 cement that withstands rain and snow in New York climate and capped with a marine grade wood. And we are now using this building as a case study, not only to track erosion, but also to trace the material geographies and carbon of the materials and tools and the participants. The representation of trade routes and material geographies is really critical to the analyzing and understanding of supply chain flows, especially for materials that are non-conventional, like earth-based and fiber-based materials, and to change this negative perception on these type of materials. So tracking and comparing the localized supply chain and procurement lines is really key, especially in urban areas. And what you can see here is a mapping of the streams of clays and fibers in the city of Paris and around the unique Seine waterfront that was then translated into a sgraffito wall. Sgraffito is a carving method of 2 or 3 layers of finish of render, usually used in lime, in a very Eurocentric locality. However, we used here this Eurocentric technique with the agency of mud. The walls were constructed from blocks, pressed from soil, excavated from tunnels, dug to expand the Paris RER rapid transit system. And the earth plaster on the interior was brought from the nearby Ile-de-France region. And above that, the sgraffito pattern represents the material procurement to provide this immediate representation of this direct supply chain. It also offered opportunities to trace the relationship between site and hinterland along lines of supply. And we had a great experience of a bunch of volunteers from this location, the Reed Hall and the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, who assisted with the project. So it's really also about engaging in the tactile, social, and technical experience of construction sequencing. You can see here a nice detail with a proper design guideline related to earth materials, and I call it a nice pair of boots and a good umbrella that you want every natural building to have, not only earth, but also bamboo and wood as well. In another study, going back to the mixed design, we characterized and tested the fresh and dry state properties of mixed design recipes in terms of their rheological, thermal, and structural application. This case for 3D printing with the goal of maximizing fiber content. We analyzed a range of plant fibers for their chemical composition and mechanical properties, because these are the parameters that are crucial for the printing process. This is an interesting slide because at the lab, we operate from macro to micro. We start with hands-on approaches at the lab and phenomena that we realize in our hands-on processes, and then we check them at the micro scale under an electron microscopy. And here we found that natural soils behave so much better than engineered soils of only sand and clay because of their heterogeneity and how they cover the fiber nicely. So the result of this was a series of super lightweight mixtures using agro-waste fibers from straw, hemp, kenaf, banana, fig, and hemp that are capable of producing a range of geometries to highlight this lightweightness capability. The first experimentation looked at tiling system. We investigated the symbolism and patterns in the Moroccan wedding dress, which uses weaving for structural purposes. It's a dress made of a very heavy fabric. I wore it for my own wedding. It's kind of a 400-year, very heavy fabric, but it feels very lightweight on the body. So we asked, how can we reinterpret this traditional structural fabric application using earth fiber surfaces? Or in other words, how can we make earth lightweight? Our work started with the design of spatial lines in a line-based deposited order, from line tectonics to a structural panel pattern, and from this heavy earth mass to a lightweight fibrous mesh. What does it mean to construct earth with lines? How can the fibers become an agent for a self-supporting geometry? And eventually this installation offered a nice interplay with light and shadow here at 1014 Space for Ideas in New York. We continued this experiment with further investigation into the density, flexibility, tear resistance in a more flexible fiber content, resulting in this nice flexible fabric composite that can be netted, can be patched, and can be reinforced in a mesh. We then thought, what happens if we make it a three-dimensional application? And we took this flat textile pattern into a three-dimensional weaving process using structural looms in a nice, you can see here, the low-tech procedure that involves both hand and printer. We then investigated further weaving protocols inspired by basket weaving, common in the context and traditions in the Middle East. And this paper asked, can we 3D print natural fibers to be binded with earth and be super lightweight like a basket? You can see here our tests that explore different geometries from concave to convex to cylindrical profiles, checking what are the limitations of gravity for this material, and accounting for the surface pattern that is, as you can see here, very fibrous, like a rope. We seek to push the boundaries of what digital cleanliness is, how dirty it can be, offer new textures and patterns for dirt, accounting for shrinkage, gravity, and also potential wall assemblage, but also investigating the geometry and how it provides a structural capacity as well. This is a cycle of biodegradability where we put some of our prints in water for 2 weeks, and you can see how matter is replasticized and upcycled through a direct kind of mechanism and account with water. So that was a short video showing our hackathon. Apologies, I didn't know it will have sound, but the result of this hackathon was a chair and a table that were crafted by students and then demonstrated through recyclability of the material how this potential replasticization and reuse may be influenced by shrinkage and strength. In another more recent design, we incorporated a new additive. We incorporated horse manure, often used for stabilization and water resistivity, to create a series called, one second. The series called Muddy Stools, because they use two main components. They use mud, but they also use some stool. These tools are currently commissioned and used in GSAPP's affirmation series, which brings together a planetary cohort of designers, scientists, and scholars. I might need to stand, so apologies. And the next work and the last project I'm going to show today looked at figurines as a practice, but also as a philosophy of self, looking at pre-pottery practices of making figurative artifacts using clay soils that are unburned and raw, which is a collective practice across histories in the globe that represent not only the social gatherings of us as a human species, but also private everyday practices. So figurines help us understand building materials because they show how social structures used clay as a substance that is unburned. The practice of making figurines are especially insightful because they include hand-sculpted clay, where you diffuse yourself into the figurine as a direct connection, using molds as a way not to mass produce, but rather to imprint in the mold, very much like a womb for creation. And our experiments use 3D printing as a way to take a 3D scanned model from a historic figurine and to translate it through a machine. This was part of our proposal for the Indian Ceramics Triennial, where we wanted to contemplate about this process through the encounter of clay and water. So the installation titled Transcorporal Feminism looked at the transcorporality of bodies of clay and water and the sacredness of all lives and bodies. This project also included figurines that went through a firing process. So they were glazed with used local soils and local glazes in India. And lastly, they were imbued within a brick wall that was plastered with earth and cow dung. Each figurine here is in a cave, in their housing shelter. And maybe that leads to my final slide about the exhibition for the Leagues Prize, which is kind of connects everything together. I created a medicine wheel from natural clay soils and fibers infused with medicinal resins called bkhur. It's a medicinal mixture of originating from Morocco for smudging against evil eye and allowing for purification of air. So I hope to give here a glimpse of the brick making ritual at the lab, where we use our bodies a lot in addition to the machine. And I write in the exhibition text that the composite creates a brick. The brick is used as an altar. Within a ceremony, the brick signifies a place where sacrifices can be made. The brick is used as incense to complete a cycle of renewal and degradation. Thank you for everything and for your patience today too.
Hello. Thank you to the team at the Architectural League for putting this all together. And thank you to Lola for being the sort of interlocutor with me today. I think there's like a lot of sort of unexpected overlaps, so it'll be interesting to talk through those. So I've titled this talk today, Habits Die Softly, which like I think makes sense. And yeah, we'll see. So in my practice, architecture often figures as a medium of training, of bodily training, a set of cues about how to behave, to move, to touch, how to be in the world. And in this way, architecture operates as a project of normalization, inculcating habits.
So my work is an attempt to sort of mess up this project a little bit, to make its cues and directives less obvious, to relocate them to new situations, to make its standards a bit fuzzier, to open it and us to other frequencies. So as architects, we often have to depend on norms or standards. We spec standardized building products. We reproduce the same typical details over and over. And so convention gets steadily embedded into our surroundings. Standards smooth the construction process, the production process. They make our work a little easier. They also allow us to move more comfortably through the world, to navigate it. So routines are helpful and they're self-reinforcing, but they also make it harder to shift gears, and they foreclose other ways of operating. Architectural standards proliferated like crazy in the post-war period. The construction industry benefited from spillover of the military-industrial apparatus. And so lots of new regulatory bodies were created to coordinate different sectors of the economy, like the National Bureau of Standards, which sought to standardize all of the stuff that we were making. It published reports that set standard specs for industrial building products, like the thickness of an I-beam flange, to the R value of insulation, to even the preferred number of bedrooms in a typical suburban family house. In the all-consuming eye of the NSB, alongside screw sizes and metal stiffness, the user was yet another component to be normalized, as demonstrated in this NSB report from 1975 titled User Requirements in the Home. But unlike in other industrial products, the user could also act as a conduit for norm making, supplying sources of information. So as the discipline got nervous about how its expertise was tethered to non-technical humanist principles, like soft principles, like intuition and style, it sought to remodel its methods as pseudoscientific. In this positivist turn, the user became the ultimate source of this new hard techno-cred. In academic labs and research centers like Berkeley and elsewhere, mainly in the 1970s and beyond, designers sought to apply new techniques of measurement, like statistical methods, to the user to produce quantified evidence. Sensations like heat, for example, and by proxy, culturally positioned states of embodiment like comfort, had to be converted into numerical scales. This was part of an effort to rehumanize design disciplines, through which the human got atomized and disaggregated. This new human, the user, was an endlessly refabricated entity that you could apply various techniques of measurement to produce numerical information. This proto-data could then be aggregated and averaged to produce norms. The embodied subject got subsumed and reconfigured within charts, tables, and surveys. Liz Diller has described how at, quote, the end of the 19th century, the body began to be understood as a mechanical component of industrial productivity, an extension of the factory apparatus. In this moment, in these NSB reports and associated lab experiments, the body of the user began to be understood as a quantitative matrix, an extension of the information economy. In addition to field-based methods of measurement, practitioners and academics formulated new spaces in which to produce the user. In these lab-based settings, the body of the user was stripped, reclothed, probed. Some studies recorded rectal temperature, reading the body as a heat source. And in the move to dissociate the body, the tactics of measuring it became ever more invasive and intimate. In these regimes of measurement, the body gets operationalized and made legible at the same time that it disperses into something bloodless, a heat source, a live indicator, an optical device. etc. But nonetheless, bodies act up. In my work, I often return to Audre Lorde's metaphor for the erotic. In her 1978 essay, The Uses of the Erotic, she writes, "During World War II, we bought sealed plastic packets of white uncolored margarine with a tiny, intense pellet of yellow coloring perched like topaz just inside the clear skin of the bag. We would leave the margarine out for a while to soften, and then we would pinch the little pellet to break it inside the bag, releasing the rich yellowness into the soft, pale mass of margarine. Then taking it carefully between our fingers, we would knead it gently back and forth over and over until the color had spread throughout the whole pound bag of margarine, thoroughly coloring it." For Lorde, the speed of color is the erotic, the stuff that scrambles our sense-making and suspends our habits. The erotic is not overtly or necessarily sexual, but it is a wellspring of feeling and sensation that overwhelms patriarchal orders of decency and legibility. A source of creative power. As it is massaged into the bland margarine world, the erotic unearths a ludic play between bodies and things. I take this hyper-vivid metaphor literally as a materialist account of eroticism. The erotic manifests in our material, fleshy encounters with other bodies, whether they be biotic, abiotic, synthetic, metallic, heat-emitting, or absorbing. It is the overflowing, the excess, the stuff that we share with one another outside of transactional, productive, or measurable relations. In this way, things can become media for this sharing, and that they can nudge us out of our routines. Animated by this materialist take on the erotic, my work exploits bland, over-processed systems from design standards to building codes to generic products, kneading into them a degree of slack, a moment of awkward fumbling, an upholstered panic bar, a baggy envelope, a surplus fit, an unfamiliar handhold. Erotica Generica is a recent installation and ongoing line of research that performs this nudge by modifying standard commercial building fixtures like doorknobs, kick plates, safety railings, and grab bars to press upon other bodily and psychic regions. These fixtures encode appropriate ways of touching the built environment and by proxy each other. They're designed to recede from our attention. Made from stainless steel or aluminum, they are impervious to scratching, easily cleaned, smooth and unadorned, a kind of texture that doesn't tickle or stick. They form an ambient armor. These generic fixtures are the outcome of an extended project of rationalization, by which a statistical body is assembled out of average dimensions and inscribed into our building protocols as standards. Resources like Architect's Data, first published in 1936, the DSM of architecture, specify the proper height, offset dimensions, and quantity for accommodating common acts of touching. These standards then get operationalized or written into practice through building codes, ensuring access for otherly abled bodies. In other senses, touch is deployed as a prosthetic organ of managerial control via the cockpit, situation room, or digital dashboard. On the flip side of the control panel, touch and gesture are captured as data by an ever-present surveillance apparatus. Again, the body is functionalized, mined for the extraction of value as architecture becomes synonymous with scripted mirages and atomizing fortresses of code. But as handholds allow us to gain stability, to find our footing, to initiate ordering operations, they also have a handle on us, provoking obsessive fantasies and deep anxieties that exceed scientific judgment or rational accounting. They are psychic knots, portals into libidinal frequencies. This project is about dislodging the hold that this functionalist and hygienic paradigm has on touch, to unearth the erotic dimensions of touch, the way that buildings bind us intimately together with an extended community of others, of strangers. Erotica generica is composed of a series of flirtatious interfaces through which architecture relishes in rather than suppressing its capacity to open pathways of anonymous contact, in sharing heat, swapping glances and bacteria, and trading pressure. The first interface is a column of miniature doors that must be fisted to operate. But in this case, the act of opening doesn't provide access to an interior or ensure visual legibility. It is instead a performance of unfamiliar sensation, one that reveals an exposed, disembodied arm on the backside. The pressure slide wall is a swarm of doorknobs that slide back and forth through the wall. Pressure is applied, transferred, and exchanged across a barrier. The knobs pressing up against different regions of the body are spring-loaded, allowing for some bounce to soften the impact of an opposing force. The stiffness of the spring varies according to where it meets the body, as indicated by these purplish finished knobs. The padded rocking door turns extra large push plates into swinging doors with almost mirrored surfaces, surfaces that collect and register the oils of past touches. On the flip side, the doors are padded with latex cushions. So one can tilt across the jamb, but never fully through, or be rocked by someone else on the other side. We were improvising these sort of minor details as we thought about the way that flesh would meet these various fixtures. So we devised these kind of ad hoc little corner softeners. A fleet of panic bars assemble on the floor into an upholstered bed, clicking as bodies shift on it. It's tricky to find a comfy resting position on this panic bed, with the alternation between padded cushion and steel plate. So here the body is in a continual state of repositioning. So if erotica generica messes with commercial fixtures and the codes of safety and accessibility that govern them, this next project, Polly Pockets, makes use of another generic material system, the event tent, to question the codes that regulate street activity. I began this project with my friend Aaron Powers back in the dark ages of the pandemic, when buildings were turning inside out. Dimensions of life that used to happen indoors were shifting outside, as many of you remember, leading to an outpouring of coping mechanisms, of regulations and new structures, as you can kind of see in this explanatory image of new regulations made by the city of New York. These regulations turned over a segment of territory in the city, usually reserved for parking, part of the public domain, but one used mainly for the storing of private property, vehicles, for alternative public use. And so with this inversion, involution, we felt like there was a little opening for imagining other activities that could happen in this sliver of space beyond commercial activity. The tent emerged as the architecture of choice for this newly redefined parcel because of its familiar and basic tectonic, a rapid response of generic materials. Metal or fiberglass tubes connected with standard joints to erect a rigid frame, which is then wrapped with sheeting and held down with weights. In this uncertain moment, the tent unfurled a set of architectural techniques for rapidly making inhabitable the zone between the public domain and the conditioned interior. Here, the standards of the super basic enclosure offered something of a relief amid the widespread upheaval of routines. These pandemic tents tap into a wider story of the tent as an architectural fantasy, allegory, typology. At times, the tent has offered a liberation from enclosure, as in the case of the camping tent, a vehicle of return to the scene of untouched nature. So you see that in the modernist architect R.M. Schindler's Camping in Yosemite in 1921 on the left. At other times, the tent has functioned to further entrench the primacy of containment. So we have spaces of detainment for displaced populations, like the refugee tent. And maybe more relevant to our project is the history of the tent as a temporary container for the coming together of material goods and bodies to accelerate or facilitate the circulation of capital. And again, it's the tent's standardization, the versatility of its component parts that allows it to perform in this way. In the 19th century, the tent played a critical part in the emergence of a consumer culture centered around the display of artifacts and commodities. On the left, it is a traveling gallery tent that displayed photographs when they were novelty items. And I'm placing this kind of tent as an extension or supporting space to more robust or permanent spaces of spectacle that were emerging at the time, like the Crystal Palace on the right. And then this contemporary analog to this kind of tent is this art fair tent. This is the Frieze art fair tent by Soil. These kind of big budget spectacle tents that were meant to attract capital. Thinking tectonically, in some ways, the tent contains the suspect allegory of architecture's origins. So Gottfried Semper, the German architect and writer of the 19th century, broke architecture down into these originating elements: hearth, roof, enclosure, mound. Enclosure is therefore kind of interpreted as an act of dressing and the covering of structure. And this conception of envelope was transmuted and entrenched through the dominant practice of modernist architecture. So we get curtain walls, as in Korb's 5 points of architecture. This has led to a kind of hierarchy of elements, structures, primary, enclosure, secondary, which I think also has a kind of gendered valence to it. So with poly pockets, we were wondering whether the dressing, in this case of the tent, the polyurethane sheeting, could provide structure to materials we tend to think of as non-structural, or to transform soft, floppy, diffuse, granular materials into something rigid through the act of holding them. So to dig into this question, we began with the generic materials of the street tent, and developed a series of modifications we could make to them to deconstruct the binaries embedded in the tectonic logic of the tent. And in doing so, open up other kinds of use, play, and occupation for the street tent. So we cut a roll of polyplastic sheeting into standard sizes, bolted together to make pockets that would then be filled with different building or household materials. So in these early tests, we tried using the pockets as leaky mixing bags, semi-reusable soft formwork, sort of testing the limits of what the pocket could hold. We made sort of sturdy, sort of flimsy columns. And so the pockets are outfitted with grommets at regular intervals so that they can be attached to one another in 2 directions. The nut and bolt connection allows the pockets to be easily fastened together and then disassembled and reconfigured. The pockets can be filled with whatever you sort of have on hand. They're like storage containers. It's like a Tupperware for architectural materials or for your sort of like leftover materials hanging around the house. The pockets can keep your special things safe for reuse later on, or hold trash, supplying it with new life. So in this way, it's a kit of parts and therefore open-ended. So there's a kind of a lot of possible combinations of materials and ways of putting them together. So these are some views of how it showed up in the gallery when we presented it. And sort of a series of portraits showing it in some other speculative poses: raver tent, pyramid, a tripod, beacon, shade canopy, playpen, changing booth, storage unit, seesaw, hanging rack. So in these ways, familiar components and methods of assembling can be shifted to a new setting or scenario and open up unexpected positions and channels of contact. In this final project, the railings, which is permanently installed at Body Zone in Northwest Detroit, and which you can view in the League Prize exhibition, the relocation of the common belt strap and D-ring to a series of rails in a wet room allows this apparatus to flirt with multiple uses. Its function remains conveniently open to interpretation to club members and city officials alike, inviting play with different acts under the cover of its ambiguity. The work finds here a zone to the side of named positions, specified use cases, and legal labels, a zone for, to use a phrase from Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, a certain social excess. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you too for sharing your presentations. Now we have some time for discussion and questions from the audience. And there are no questions from the audience yet, so please feel free to type them in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. There's a button that says Q&A, and you can write your questions there. In the meantime, I had some thoughts that I was going to include in the introduction, but I saved for the discussion. And so as I was trying to like kind of read these two practices together, these are some thoughts that I thought, I thought we could all discuss together. So yeah, I think first there's something that both projects have, which is the kind of the engagement with the human body, one in terms of scale, but also in terms of like sensations, and yeah, again, both in very different ways. But we can think on one hand of like, Lola's kind of cool soil garments, or the mud chair, and how that feels against the body on one hand, as well as, yeah, kind of Strat's devices for interacting, and also Strat's sort of, yeah, other projects like Strat's wearable bags that can also have like architectural function. So I think that's kind of one thread, and I think maybe we can all talk about that. And I have more things that I think we can kind of have a reading of both practices together, while people write down their questions.
I can relate to that and say I understand also what you said, Strat, about the similarities between our work and the links, and how it's connected. I'm going to be very kind of, there's something also very much about the work about eroticism that I kind of reflects on my even nowness experience of nursing my kid while talking about my work, and how my body participate in my work, even in the most formal moments. And I think it's a really interesting link that crosses boundaries between bodies, between type of bodies, between age, gender, etc. That is really interesting for me to think about, and I really love that we were put together in this lecture too, Strat, because of that.
Yeah, totally. I think like we're both sort of contending with the hold that like a certain way of knowing and working with the world has on the discipline. One that kind of mandates measurable performance indicators as a basis of success. You know, there's a kind of like ongoing march of like quantification. You know, like things have to be measurable so that we can assess whether they are a success, whether they are valid, whether they perform well. And so, yeah, I think we're both contending with that in very like different ways. And I think like that's so interesting in the way that you're sort of, you know, taking on the really like fine-grained tools and techniques of like lab-based practice, but not directing them towards optimization or towards the production of a kind of like a smoothness in the product, in the finished product, but allowing for like a range, like redefining performance as like within a range of like workability or usability. And I think of like Winnicott's theories of like the good enough mother. And I like to think of that as a way of working that applies to sort of the way that we engage with material as designers, that things can be good enough, that optimization sometimes produces like over-engineered products. It leads to like forms of making that maybe are like destructive in other ways, like they have externalities to achieve a certain level of optimization and performance.
I completely agree with that. They have externalities and they are enmeshed and they're also endless. In an engineered world, you can endlessly go into the technoscience or technocratic needs from a certain material, or if we go back to an assembly even. And it's not only about the material, it's also, you know, when you think about performance, like a life cycle assessment. Mathematically, there is endless tiers of calculations into these analysis. So it is kind of a foggy spiral that one can even lose understanding of other challenges involved in not only ecological but social entanglements and problems in a wider global context.
Yeah, it's interesting that I hadn't seen that kind of the element of control in Lola's work, but I think there's an interesting connection there as well. I was like trying to figure out like because I think that's something that's useful about the theme dirty is that we can speak about these things that are like on one hand we're maybe kind of pushing back against or reacting against, but we're always, you know, as architects and designers, we're also always implicated with these forces. You know, and I was like trying to think like what are these forces for each of your practices, and I was thinking that maybe in Lola's case it's like, you know, that kind of dirty traditional or like industrial forms and materials and forms of construction. And in the case of Strat, I was thinking that maybe it's more like, yeah, this like kind of this element of control that can't be separated from design. But I think that actually control is also very much part of Lola's work, and like as something that I feel like the work is pushing against, but also ultimately implicated with, like the fact that these industrial materials are made to conform with standard measurements, and these machines as well that produce them. I think in Nola's work, where we see them trying to engage with these same techniques to produce materials that are maybe allowed to be more loose. So I think control is another thread that I hadn't thought about until now. Okay, we have one question from the audience. So yeah, and anonymous attendee is saying, yes, Strat, I'm compelled by the directness of your material reasoning, while the use is both reconsidered and mysterious. And so they ask in the last piece, an object without a named function, I said, continuing your interest to recalibrate how we as a society see and recognize objects as a way of destroying the post-war rationalization of society.
Whoa, that's a crazy. Wait, can you repeat the last phrase of that? That was
Yeah, I mean, the question is whether the last piece is the last piece, which is an object without a named function, whether that piece is continuing your interest to recalibrate how we as a society see and recognize objects, as a way of destroying the post-war rationalization of society.
Well, yes, yeah, definitely, yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, like in that case, the kind of like strategic ambiguity is consistent with like some of my earlier work, where it's meant to invite a kind of moment of interpretation or like confusion about, okay, what do I do with this? How do I handle this? How do I operate this? But it was also important, given the kind of politics and like regulation of these kind of spaces of intimacy, that it could not be identified, that it resisted a kind of labeling or identification by like the state apparatus, and in that case, that being like city officials and people who are responsible for enforcing building ordinances and permits.
Mm-hmm.
So so I was trying to kind of work within, because I wanted the work to be shown by an audience that is larger than the club members of this particular establishment, but without in a discrete way that didn't kind of undermine or require that the installation be removed or shut down, the operation be shut down. And that was, I think that's an interesting place to be in, because I think as architects, typically we want to be clear about what the project is, and to like promote it. That's part of the game, the hustle that we're in. So in that case, like, this is a kind of different way that I think for me in that project, this kind of like ambiguity was operating in response to kind of the regulatory situation.
Yeah, I mean, and now that we're talking about like you know, these state mechanism and the state and mechanisms and mechanisms of control. I was another question that I had as you two were presenting was whether, because I think there's another interesting connection between both of your kind of practices is that you know, I think that like I think that, and this is a question for Lola, but I think that thinking of like what's outside control and what's outside these like, or what's the opposite, or what's outside these kind of industrial materials. You know, obviously in the case of Lola, that the name of your lab has the word natural, and I was wondering if you had like a working definition of natural, because I think something that you didn't talk a lot about in the presentation, but I think is in your work and in your portfolio is kind of how that dichotomy of natural versus artificial, or like that spectrum or whatever, can sometimes be a little bit arbitrary or ambiguous. And I was just wondering if you have any more thoughts or like, like a kind of working definition of natural or nature in you know, with respect to your work and the lab.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Usually I have a few slides that kind of try to have a discourse about the definition, because everything around us is natural. Everything in even the room that is I'm in now is made of natural materials. My laptop is sitting on a wooden desktop with metal legs that are made from ore-bearing rock, and with there's probably some concrete that is made from calcined limestone, maybe some very old fiberglass in the this old building in Columbia University, which is made from barium and from sand. But what is the extent of processing between harvesting something at source and then placing it into our buildings is something that I continuously ask, how it can define what natural is. And I usually seek for aspects in a material to work with it at the lab. It needs to be somewhat readily available and locally available within a certain mileage from my place of work, so it's very site specific. It needs to be non-toxic for human and for the land. It needs to be even perhaps healthy and community engaging. And with that materials we work, so I often say that it's really a material I can work with my bare hands. And with the relation to control, there's something about materials that answer this definition are typically extremely variable. So soil that I find from one project that is harvested from foundation level would be very different from other soils in other location, even in the same region. And fiber batches, you know, each batch of plant or agro-waste fiber will be completely different. And that is part of why upcycling is sometimes hard with these materials, but this variability, I think, is part of the magic. It's intriguing to me. I think it's part of what's really wonderful about these materials. And there's another thing I wanted to say about control, and it's the iterative process about working with experimental materials, and maybe that Strat and my presentations don't show. And it's important to me to stress that if there are students in the audience, that we do show the most controlled output and the somewhat most perfect representation or portrait of our work, but there are so many iterations, and I'm sure behind Strat's work as well to find the exact element and artifacts and place them in your installation Strat. So it is a very meticulous iterative process that is happening with materials and with the found objects as well. And I think it also relates to control, because there is some control in that process. There is some path or trajectory being seeked. So it's important to stress that.
Yeah, we have another question this one's from Anne. And she's saying, Lola, your work seems to arc between issues of permanence and temporality. So how do you and the Natural Materials Lab prioritize that balance between materials and function within these experimental projects? And I think just to add my own question to that, but I think that maybe Strat can also speak about temporality, because their work is also often, I mean, they showed, I think, only one permanent work that's installed permanently. So maybe both of you can speak about that.
Yeah, maybe a short thing about the lab is that we try to release a lot. So things that have gone through a certain journey in an exhibition, or maybe our lab space is very small at GSAPP because, you know, we're in the middle of New York. After all, then we just recycle it, we shred it, and we reprint with it. So there's a lot of work of releasing objects back to being used, which I think is really important. But then in my other hat, let's say, of policy and trying to understand how building codes for earth materials advance, it's looking at sound design protocols for using such materials, so that their durability is not compromised, so that they are having this lifespan possible for natural materials, as we can see in historical monuments, for instance.
Yeah, so I think in my work, it's kind of a really striking counterpoint to, I think, Lola's work, where like I am purposely using products that are industrially produced, pretty generic, standard, and so they can kind of be they have a longer lifespan, and they can kind of be like lugged around and treated with a little less like care. And so I've been trying to kind of make use of those qualities. And so like the railings project that I showed at the end actually like remixes and reuses some of the fixtures that I'd used for the previous project of Erotica Generica. So I'm trying to kind of, as much as I can, like use as input stuff from previous projects and kind of keep them moving and kind of reconfiguring. And in some cases, like trying to return things, like exploiting the really like generous and bizarre return policies of some of these huge distributor companies and Home Depot, like and trying not to alter products too much so that I can actually that they're unchanged from their kind of off the shelf state. And yeah, and then I guess in that sense gives them a kind of a way of like reappearing and being sort of transposed and supporting new kinds of situations and scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, one thing is the kind of the like material life cycle of the stuff that you make, but I was also wondering about the temporality of the thing itself. Like in the, you know, in one case we have like prototypes where the like material prototypes where the life cycle, the material life cycle is very tied to the fact that they're prototypes, or they may be used to test something and then recycled, and then tests kind of have like physical material tests maybe, and they also have exhibition purposes. And in the case of Strat's work, the temporality also has to do with kind of how the thing is meant to be experienced. So I think I meant more, you know, I think the other answer is also interesting, but I meant more like, how do you two think of also the temporality of the experience? Like in the case of Strat's work, yeah, I think you only showed one installation that's permanent or semi-permanent, and how and how that has to do with how it can be displayed and discussed, etc. So I was wondering if you could speak more about that as well.
Yeah, so yeah, the Erotica Generica project was a temporary thing, but in many ways built to be permanent. And that was also just kind of like, in a way, I was really trying to make the thing robust so that it could actually receive the kinds of like intense handling and use that I was hoping it would solicit. So there was a way that like even despite it being a kind of temporary build, I had like, I wanted to over engineer it. I was drilling into the concrete floor, like just doubling up like studs in the walls to make sure that it was really like solid. So yeah, I'm trying to think of like how that is answered. Yeah. So
Strat, what was the reaction? I'm curious to hear what was the reaction from the space or from the venue?
Yeah.
If you're a bit, because I know the reaction to bringing mud into a venue is very particular. So I'm wondering, in your case, what was the kind of work process and how did you handle that?
Yeah, so I mean, it was like, I think I was worried that it actually would not really get much use, because I think that's typically how we approach the kind of format of like a gallery installation. We've been like, again, kind of like trained to perform a specific like mode of relating to that kind of work. And so yeah, that was my concern. And then I think there was a way that somehow like people felt really compelled to like touch, to move these things, to push things, to like lean up against stuff. I think it helped that there were like a number of like young people, like kids, at the opening that don't have that kind of deeply instilled like comportment, you know, like they haven't learned that the sort of appropriate way of like consuming art or that kind of work. And so they were just like running at the walls and like just like punching things and running through things. It was like, I was so happy with that, that they were kind of like actually testing the limits of what this thing could receive. And those are the forms of kind of like of contact that I'm like trying to make space for across these different these works of different kinds of permanence or temporariness.
Yeah, because the other question I had that has to do with this is whether you have whether you have thought of how, but for both of you, how these things could exist outside that kind of controlled space of the lab being, you know, either like literally the lab or an exhibition where you're displaying these materials, or a kind of gallery, you know, like a kind of architectural exhibition where you're displaying these materials, or like a gallery space where you're showing like, yeah, I don't know, like, have you tested, or have you thought of testing, or what, or are you interested in at all in like, you know, producing a series of the mud chair for people to like install in their lawn and see how they work, how long they last, or like whether one of these devices from Strat's work could, you know, whether it's something that whether it would make sense for someone to install that in their house or something. Just that, yeah, because I don't think we saw any, maybe the the permanent installation at the club is an example in Strat's work, and the kind of rammed earth wall in the case of Lola's work are two examples of like semi-permanent, but there's still kind of one proof of concept things. I was just wondering if there have been any attempts or any interest in these other forms of circulation for your work.
Yeah, and I have an interesting example, for instance, in the raw earth sgraffito in Paris, and even in the farm to building in upstate New York is a permanent project. So there's often ambiguity about whether the project will be permanent or temporary, but it's there and probably not going anywhere soon. And it, because of its shape, because these experimental materials sometimes are tackled with inquiry of how long will they be lasting on site, especially in an outdoor exhibition site. So when people or curators can see that the material behaves really nice with the weather, then there's more openness for permanence. So the farm to building is permanent currently, but then the raw earth sgraffito in Paris, I was starting to mention that it will be taken down this summer, and not because it's in deteriorating conditions, but rather because as an experimental material, it must be a temporary one on the grounds of an historic site in Paris. And then we are treating the taking down of this pavilion as part of the work, as an experimental part of the work. And each item in this pavilion will receive an afterlife. The wood cap is going to an artist who's using wood. The compressed earth blocks will be used for gardening in the site. So every piece will arrive somewhere and be used. But you're right. Sometimes I laugh with my friends that artwork sometimes turn out as garbage. So we do, and we experiment and we create, and then what do we do with all these materials and artifacts? And luckily in this cycle of my work with earth and fiber-based materials, it's quite easy to transform them anew, but it's not always the case. I see that with studio projects, with models. It's like that in our profession and throughout the building industry, of course.
Yeah, no, and to add to that, I also wonder, I think that there's something that, and this is not at all my area of expertise, but it's something that I've noticed happening, where these kind of academic experiments also usually become like turn into like actual products that are produced by big companies. And I was just wondering, like, how much of like that value that's created in academic environments is like, you know, either unjustly captured by these big companies, or like whether people like yourself, you could go and start a company that sort of produces these materials and techniques at a greater scale. I mean, I just think it's like a part of the process that's like often not talked about. And I was just curious what you think about these things and these dynamics, especially with like industry really in relation with academia and research and these laboratories that are funded up from you know different ways than like a kind of research lab within a company.
Yeah, it's a tough question, an important one, because when you talk about architectural materials, there's a lot of or patenting a certain method or certain machine or technology, and then what happens with patenting is that often it takes away from the possibility of upscaling, because oftentimes it remains very niche or controlled, going back to the notion of control. So while there is a need to acknowledge effort and research effort and to publish the work, to present and exhibit the work, their interaction with more industrial practices, at least from the point a view at the Natural Materials Lab is something that we are really critically looking at and not always very kind of fond of, let's say, inscribing as an intellectual property.
Mhm.
I think it's important to keep a very strong openness about materials that are non-commodified.
Yeah.
That's from my point of view, but I'm curious, Strat, how it goes with you as you are using ready-made almost.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think just thinking about like the way that the pressures, you know, to like find some capital to support this kind of work, how to navigate that. And yeah, and I think with this latest project, it was really nice to like open my work out to a different context and space that like of a kind that I think typically doesn't really receive much attention from like design disciplines or from like architects, you know, that yeah. And yeah, I mean, like I'm really excited about now trying to kind of find additional ways to bring the kind of like skills that I have to these other spaces, and you know, provide just like some minor moments of like pleasure. And I think like that's what I want to keep doing.
Right. I think that's all the time we have for discussion. I want to thank everyone again. Thanks, Lola, thanks, Strat. And yeah, I'll let Anne speak.
I think ending on those moments of pleasure is a really good place to both end this week and lead into next week, where we'll have 2 additional speakers, same time, same non-place, with Eric Carranza of Mexico City and Leigh Wolfman of Salt Lake City. And you know, in all of these weeks, and this year in particular, I think the jury and the committee and all of us involved with the project were really struck by the level of kind of engagement, really interesting construction, and an overarching sense of sort of play in the everyday and what that means with that kind of engagement. So we're really looking forward to continuing the conversation, and thank everyone for joining us, today's speakers and today's moderator, and stay tuned for more.